On this Sunday night, a high-stakes NATO summit. The security alliance faces tough decisions on Ukraine.
Russia's aggression will not pay.
Why the meeting is sparking security concerns, and the Canadian military mission set to be extended. The heat is on. More weather warnings for millions of Canadians and Americans. Another blow to Afghan women in the workforce.
What we are going to do after this.
What the Taliban is targeting now. Plus, a shortage of spice.
Some get mad at me.
Restaurants are taking heat after a pause in production of hot sauce.
Global National with Farah Nasser. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with what could be a critical week for the future of Ukraine. With no end in sight to Russia's invasion, NATO leaders are gathering in Lithuania for a key summit. The world's biggest security alliance is divided on several issues, including if and how Ukraine should be granted membership. The Ukrainian president plans to attend the annual meeting this week, looking for security guarantees.
We would like to have all the decisions to be made during the summit. In this case, it's obvious that I'll be there and I'll be doing whatever I can in order to, so to speak, expedite that solution, to have an agreement with our partners.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will also attend the NATO summit, and on his way to Lithuania, he'll stop first in Latvia, where Canada has its largest overseas military deployment. Our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, will be traveling with the Prime Minister. David.
Well, Jeff, the stop in Riga, Latvia is an important prelude for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ahead of the NATO summit in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. In Riga Monday morning, the Prime Minister will meet with the 800 or so Canadian troops who were part of a NATO battle group stationed there. He was last there in the spring of 2022. Trudeau will also meet with his Latvian counterpart, and they are expected to announce that Canada will commit to an extended military presence in Latvia. Remember, earlier this year, Canada announced it would send a squadron of 15 tanks to join this battle group. Those tanks are expected to depart via ship from Montreal in the fall. Then, on Tuesday and Wednesday, Trudeau joins other NATO leaders in Vilnius for what some analysts say may be the most important NATO summit in decades. On the agenda, NATO expansion, boosting defense spending and military deployments in Europe, and of course, the war in Ukraine.
For 500 days, Moscow has brought death and destruction to the heart of Europe, seeking to destroy Ukraine and divide NATO. Our summit will send a clear message. NATO stands united, and Russia's aggression will not pay.
This will also be one of the most heavily defended NATO summits ever. Vilnius is just 30 kilometers from the border with Russia's ally Belarus, and Russia itself is less than 300 kilometers away.
This situation is really very tense because of aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine. So it's already on a very, very high level.
The Prime Minister is expected to return to Canada on Thursday. Jeff.
David Aiken in Ottawa. Thanks, David. The U.S. president will also attend this week's NATO summit, of course. He's departing today and stopping first for a brief visit to Britain. Joe Biden will meet with King Charles and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak before leaving for Lithuania on Tuesday. Back here in Canada, there's a glimmer of hope in the BC port strike, which is now into its 9th day. Talks between the Port Workers Union and their employers resumed this weekend after breaking down last week. Grace Key joins us from Vancouver, where workers have gathered for a rally. Grace.
A massive turnout at Jack Pool Plaza in downtown Vancouver. There were striking union members and local and international labor leaders. They came from the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. They said they had two messages. One was a shared struggle for workers to get fair compensation during these tough economic times, and the second to show solidarity. They pointed out shipping companies and terminals have made record profits, especially during the pandemic when members continued working to keep the economy moving.
Workers not only on Longshore, but workers around this country, workers non-union, workers union should never apologize for the money, the benefits that they earn, because the profits that these corporate whores take from us is our money.
The BC Maritime Employers Association did release a statement on Saturday. They said that both sides met on Saturday with a federal mediator and that proposals were made and rejected. So now they do await the direction from those federal mediators. Jeff?
Grace Key in Vancouver. Thanks, Grace. Protesters rallied outside a Montreal graveyard today, frustrated over a strike that's kept Canada's largest cemetery closed to the public since January. Mourners are demanding the Quebec government intervene after a tentative agreement between the union and management fell apart last month. Hundreds of bodies have gone unburied, and the grounds have fallen into disrepair, with weeds growing waist high, and debris from an ice storm in April still hasn't been cleaned up. The city of Winnipeg is giving protesters at a local landfill site until tomorrow afternoon to remove their blockade. The protests there began Thursday after Manitoba's premier confirmed the province will not conduct a search of another landfill for the bodies of 2 missing women. Winnipeg police believe the remains of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron are in the Prairie Green landfill. An alleged serial killer is charged with their murders. The premier says it's up to the federal government to decide whether to search. Speaking with Global News today, protesters denied reports that they plan to leave, insisting the blockade will remain. The heat wave gripping most of Canada is showing no signs of cooling. Temperatures are soaring from coast to coast to coast. Heat warnings are in place for 6 provinces and 2 territories, with temperatures exceeding 30 degrees across several regions. And conditions are even more extreme south of the border. The U.S. National Weather Service has issued dangerous heat alerts for tens of millions of Americans. Global National's new Houston correspondent Jamie Mouracher reports.
In the sweltering summer months, getting an early start to the day is about safety as much as it's about productivity for this Ohio farmer.
We start early in the morning and try to beat the heat.
Heat that's so extreme in some areas, it's forcing over 50 million Americans to do whatever they can to stay cool. In the hardest hit Southwest, Phoenix, Arizona, typically stifling this time of year, hasn't had a day under 40 degrees Celsius all month long. And there are warnings of the mercury climbing to near 50 in the coming days. Reaching that number would break an all-time record.
If you listen to the scientists, which not enough people are, the last week they have described as terrifying and as uncharted territory.
Daniel Johnson has studied heat waves for 2 decades and points the finger at a pronounced El Nino season and a change in climate.
As greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere, extreme heat events are one of the principal effects expected.
With that comes the increased risk of wildfires. In Canada, a record-breaking 8.8 million hectares of land has already burned this year, and smoke has polluted air quality across the country, reaching south of the border.
We need to bring the emissions of these heat-trapping gases down to zero. And then we need to be removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere.
The continuing heat dome recently put parts of Texas amongst the hottest places on Earth. Now experts say we need to focus on cooling the climate down in order to prevent our summers from heating up. Jeff?
Jamie Mouracher, keeping cool in Houston. Thanks, Jamie. The relationship status between the U.S. and China has been complicated for a while, with tensions over Taiwan, Chinese surveillance balloons, and allegations of genocide over Beijing's treatment of Uyghur Muslims. But the 2 superpowers say it's time to patch things up. And to that end, the U.S. Treasury Secretary traveled to Beijing for some high-stakes diplomacy. Mackenzie Gray has the details.
It's not the pomp and circumstance you'd usually see for a major international trip, but U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's visit to China is an opportunity to reset one of the most important international relationships.
The U.S. and China have significant disagreements. Those disagreements need to be communicated clearly and directly.
And Yellen did just that in meetings with some of China's top officials. But there seemed to be no progress made on issues like the war in Ukraine and what Yellen calls unfair economic practices by Beijing.
These conversations were direct, substantive, and productive. We were able to learn more about each other's economies and policy choices, which I believe is vital as the world's 2 largest economies.
And those economies have been soaring together. From iPhones to solar panels to soybeans, the two biggest economies in the world have exchanged $700 billion worth of goods in the last year, a new record. But trade alone can't bridge the gap on major issues like Beijing's treatment of the Muslim Uyghur minority, problems in Hong Kong, and a potential invasion of Taiwan, which could bring the two countries into direct conflict.
Right now, I'm particularly worried because it seems like the two countries, the United States and China, have given up on one another.
U.S. President Joe Biden has spent hundreds of billions to try and lure jobs back to the States from China in key businesses like microchip production. That's a sector the administration will soon put new rules on, limiting American investment in Chinese microchip firms.
There is a lot of friction, both trade-related as well as geopolitical, in terms of how both countries are drifting apart and where they are today and where they're likely to be in the near future.
Those new American rules on microchip investments are still being written, but Joe Biden has another major decision to make: whether or not he'll keep in place billions of dollars worth of tariffs on China that his potential 2024 opponent, Donald Trump, slapped on Beijing. Jeff?
Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mac. Unrest in Israel. Coming up, protests reignite ahead of a crucial vote on that controversial judicial reform bill. Plus,
this is a very poignant evening.
Goodbye, Yellow Brick Road. Elton John's emotional farewell. Israel's prime minister appears to be losing patience with protesters rallying against his hugely controversial judicial reforms. Critics argue the changes will undermine democracy and weaken the power of the courts. A key vote on the proposal is set for tomorrow and comes 1 week after Israeli forces launched a deadly raid on a Palestinian refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. Redmond Shannon explains how the prospect of peace and the future of Israel's justice system are connected.
A delegation of European diplomats navigates what's left of parts of Jenin in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli Defense Forces raid there earlier in the week killed 12 and left roads and homes in rubble. Mahmoud surveys what's left of his house too. He says the outside world has ignored the plight of Palestinians for 75 years, and he thinks nothing much is going to change. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the goal of the raid was to stamp out militant bases, but low-tech explosive labs can be quickly rebuilt, and deadly raids only stoke more anger, according to analyst Professor Yossi Meckelberg.
If you look further than the immediate, it solves absolutely nothing. Again, it makes actually the situation worse. We see the time and again, especially with Gaza, for instance.
A 90-minute drive from Jenin, noise and anger in Tel Aviv.
We don't know, no one knows what will happen this week in Israel.
6 months of disruptive protests have pushed against Netanyahu's proposed changes to Israel's justice system, as the longtime leader fights his own legal battles against allegations of corruption and fraud. The so-called reasonableness bill gets its first reading in Parliament Monday, which critics argue will reduce the power of the courts to overrule government decisions. On Sunday, Netanyahu called for a review into whether police should intervene more strongly in protests. The Jenin raids may have been a convenient distraction from his plans for the courts, but the issues do overlap too.
The Supreme Court protects and defends and secures and guarantees human rights and political rights on one side, actually approves expansion of settlements on occupied land, sealing of houses, demolishing of houses.
The week ended in Israel and the West Bank with more funerals. Not deaths from the Jenin raids, but from a revenge attack that followed. The seemingly never-ending spiral of violence and grief shows little sign of slowing down. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Repressive regime still ahead. Why the Taliban is targeting Afghanistan's beauty salons. Welcome back. It's been almost 2 years since the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan, reviving their relentless oppression on the rights and freedoms of women and girls. The UN calls it gender apartheid and says Afghanistan is the most repressive country in the world for women. And it seems the Taliban isn't done yet. Global Shagufa Danish reports on the regime's latest crackdown.
Beauty salons are one of the last safe haven for women in Afghanistan. They too are about to disappear. The Taliban has ordered salons close in 1 month.
Everyone got scared. What we are going to do after this?
28-year-old Fatima opened her business 5 years ago and has 5 employees.
We are worried about how to survive. Right now, we lost everything, even our hopes, our wishes, our future.
Jamila is also devastated that she and her 30 colleagues will soon be out of work. We can't feed ourselves without this beauty salon. The Taliban is banning salons, claiming their work is forbidden by Islam, and that their services are too expensive for grooms who pay during weddings. It's all part of a larger effort to erase women from public life. The Taliban has barred women and girls from schools, universities, and most jobs.
It seems the Taliban starts their day in the morning thinking of what else has left for women so that we can ban and we restrict.
Afghanistan's 12,000 salon owners are now preparing to close. But the decision will affect thousands more. Many of these women are the main breadwinners of their families. This will only create more hardship. 95% of people in Afghanistan live below the poverty line.
There should be something done to stop this atrocity and this crisis that's going on against women in the country.
Aid organization and Afghan women fear there will be few consequences. They want women in Afghanistan to disappear. An edict robbing women of their income and their dignity. Shagufa Danish, Global News, Ottawa.
Hot sauce shortage. Up next, why spice lovers have been left out in the cold. The Rocket Man is retiring, saying goodbye to the yellow brick road. After almost 4,600 performances over an incredible 52 years, Elton John has performed his final concert, though he says there may be one-offs in the future. The 76-year-old's marathon farewell tour kicked off in 2018 and was supposed to end in 2021, but both the pandemic and a hip injury delayed that. While John says he's done touring, he plans to continue working on new music. And a concert of a much different sort is making waves in the Florida Keys. These under-the-sea musicians aren't actually playing instruments. Instead, they're miming along to music piped through waterproof speakers under the boats above. The Underwater Music Festival is held every year to advocate for coral reef preservation. The Florida Keys is home to the only living barrier coral reef in the continental U.S. As temperatures soar, a lot of people are trying to beat the heat. Others, though, still want to spice things up by dousing their food with hot sauce. That is, if you can find a bottle. Mike Drolet explains what's fueling the hot sauce shortage that has some spice lovers getting salty.
Hot sauce lovers are always asking for more heat. The farms that produce them, right now, heat is their biggest problem. Mexico, like large swaths of Canada, is caught in an epic heat wave. 45-degree temperatures combined with depleted water supplies have farmers like Antonio hoping for a miracle. There's been no rainfall, so we have to irrigate the crops manually, he says. But the drought is so severe, there's no water for irrigation.
It sure looks good.
Spice of Life, a manufacturer north of Toronto, relies on those Mexican peppers to give its product that extra punch.
She's hot. She is hot.
Ontario peppers aren't ripe until late summer or early fall. leaving owner Nadia Harlow in a pinch.
I have faced challenges trying to get peppers. I've had to discontinue one of my popular sauces just based on the fact that I just cannot find the peppers for that.
The shortage is becoming an annual occurrence. The incredibly popular Huifang sriracha, which uses the red jalapeno hybrid chili pepper from Mexico, has had supply issues since 2020, forcing restaurants to adapt.
Some get mad at me and some they do understand. Well, they think that we lie to them, but we offer them other kind of sauce and they just don't want to try.
On Amazon, a hard-to-find pack of 2 sriracha sauces is selling for $110. There's more on eBay selling for equally preposterous prices, but at least sanity prevailed with 0 bids for this open and expired bottle. If the drought continues in Mexico, Canadian producers may have to look at alternatives, such as growing more of their own, because there's no shortage of demand for that sweet, sweet heat.
I think it's still building. Hot.
Mike Trollet, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Iqaluit, where residents are celebrating Nunavut Day. On this day, 30 years ago, Parliament passed the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement Act, which gave the Inuit people a separate portion of the Northwest Territories to call their own. Nunavut didn't become legally independent until April 1st of 1999, but the signing of the act was hugely significant, and so the annual holiday is now observed on July the 9th. Happy birthday, Nunavut, and thanks for watching. Donna will be back here with you tomorrow. Have a great night.